All right, so let's move on to chapter 11, which is about the physical and chemical ways to control microbes. So why control microbial growth? Well, the answer to this seems obvious to us right now in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. So prior to knowing about germ theory, though, people were so ignorant of the importance of sterility and cleanliness that surgeons reportedly would clean their knives on their boots, particularly when lined up with patients like during wartime. So this seems outrageous to us now, right? But if you don't know that microbes exist, if you don't know that microbes cause infection and disease, then why not just clean your scalpel on your boot before you go on to the next patient, right? So surgeries, there wasn't a great outcome. About 50%, there's about a 50% mortality rate for surgeries. So you had a 50-50 chance of coming out of a surgery alive. And most of those deaths were due to infection. Also, about 25% of delivering mothers would die of infection. Now, that number, these numbers really vary depending on the setting. So like the numbers could be pretty high when it's during wartime, really dirty conditions. Also, delivering mothers in certain kinds of hospitals, because hospitals were a horrible place to give birth before we knew about disease. Even now, they are filled with pathogens, right? Because that's where all the sick people go. So, but now in hospitals today, there's a lot of effort made to contain pathogens to one patient's room, the patient that brought it in, and then to get rid of it, to sterilize things before they move from patient to patient. But before we knew about germs, before germ theory, there was no such thing. So you just have person after person after person delivering in the same room with no sterile technique, no ways to really clean up after each sick person or delivering mother arrived and left the room. So the mortality rate was actually lower outside of hospitals because of this. And I want to talk, I know that there's a lot of talk about the Spanish flu these days. It comes up almost every flu season, and then also with this COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people compare this to the Spanish flu, which is not a fair comparison at all. These are two different diseases. They affect a different demographic, but it's still important, because people talk about the Spanish flu so much, and because it caused so much damage at that time. It's worth talking about, and because when we're talking about controlling microbial growth, sometimes that's about using chemical and physical controls, and sometimes it's about using what we call non-pharmaceutical control methods to stymie spread, and that's what the social distancing is about. We're not going to talk that much about social distancing in this chapter, but when you have a disease spread and so quickly that it's difficult to create physical or chemical barriers to its spread, then you can use these what we call non-pharmaceutical or non-chemical methods to prevent spread, and that's just by people isolating themselves. And that's what we ended up doing to deal with the Spanish flu as well. So the Spanish flu happened during World War I, and there was a global pandemic. And one of the main reasons it went global is because of the war. So soldiers were flying to different parts of the globe, all over the globe, and bringing the pathogen with them when they went. The earliest cases of Spanish flu were kept on the DL in order to keep up morale. So actual death tolls were not actually acquired until after the war was over. And we still may not have accurate numbers because of that. So basically what happened, traveling soldiers carried the disease with them across Europe and the globe, creating a massive global pandemic. Now, most flus kill the weak, the very old, and the very young, right? But this flu was different. The Spanish flu created what we call a cytokine storm, which essentially means it caused massive overreaction of the body's immune system, like a really, really bad allergic reaction. Cytokines are the communication molecules of your immune system. So when different cells of your immune system want to talk to each other and activate each other, they send these chemical signals called cytokines. Well, the Spanish flu pathogen, that virus caused a cytokine storm, meaning it caused an over-release of cytokines, which overactivated all the immune cells in the body. We'll talk about cytokine storms more when we talk about immunity at the end of term. So the Spanish flu caused basically a really bad, a massive case of over-inflammation, like a really bad allergic reaction. So healthy adults with healthy immune systems were perhaps especially hard hit. So you had a total decimation of the workforce. So most flus and also COVID-19, the highest death tolls are among those with pre-existing conditions, those who are very old, and with flus it tends to be the very young as well, not so much with COVID-19. But the Spanish flu was unique in that it targeted the healthy people in the population more than anyone else. So this overly intense immune response sometimes caused brain damage, putting some patients in a coma-like state, or it sometimes caused hemorrhaging from the nose and other mucous membranes. It was absolutely a horrific way to die. 10 to 20% of people who were infected died. Now, most flus kill only 0.1% of those infected. Right? The massive death rates and extensive global spread caused some people to call this one of the greatest medical holocausts in history. And some counts suggest the Spanish flu killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years, just to give you an idea of the scale. So there were 50 to 100 million deaths in 2 years, but you have to remember that back then the world population was far, far smaller than it is today. We've gone through a couple doubling times since then. So this, in terms of relation to the global population, this count is, right now, that would be a high death count for us today. But remember that we have over 7 billion people. We didn't even have half that at that time. So this death toll was exceedingly high for a world that was much smaller at the time. So there were 2 waves of this pandemic, and the second wave was more deadly than the first. So the reason for this, and this is a really interesting study in the evolution of pathogenicity. Normal citizen life conditions favor mild strains of diseases. And the reason is, so if you're just living in normal citizen life, very, very sick people stay home. And so the people who are sick with the most deadly strains of the disease, they don't transmit it as much because they're sick in bed. They're not out and about spraying the disease everywhere when they sneeze, right? But while people who are moderately or mildly sick, those are the ones going out, those are the ones spreading the disease. So the mild strains are actually favored by natural selection because of our human behavior. The mild strains are in hosts that go around, they allow their hosts to go around and spread the disease more. Whereas the sickest people stay home in bed, so the harshest strains, their hosts aren't able to spread them as much. And so mild strains, actually, this is why diseases do, especially those transmitted by contact transmission, they do tend to evolve towards mildness over time. Okay, but the thing is, in the trenches, soldiers were infecting fellow soldiers, and even those who were very, very sick were carried to civilian areas, spreading severe forms of the disease. And so in those unusual warlike conditions, evolution worked the reverse. Natural selection favored the opposite of what it usually favors for contact transmission. Because usually when someone's sick in bed with a very, very severe strain of a particular disease, their friends aren't carrying them out into public places, right? They leave them home and isolated. But in warlike conditions, that's exactly what was happening. So even the people with the deadliest strains were spreading the disease. Then suddenly, the flu mostly disappeared in the span of a single month at the end of 1918. And we don't really know why that is. It could be that the disease mutated to a less lethal form, which, like I said, is common for most diseases. As people infected with the most lethal forms, they tend to die out or stay at home until they're better, right? And so the less lethal forms eventually, and especially since towards the end of this, people were practicing social distancing, and so that would have allowed people to, prevent transmission where transmission wasn't being controlled before. So it just so happens that Germany seems to have been infected before the Allies, and this is just a little bit of interesting history that isn't talked about much. Germany was infected before the Allies, our allies, right, the Allies, and Germany seemed to have sustained higher death rates from the Spanish flu. There is evidence that the distribution of destruction from Spanish flu tipped the odds of the war heavily in our favor. And so it likely played, this flu likely played an important role in history in regards to how World War I played out. The virus has this, and if you're interested in the Spanish flu today, you know, how this relates to things today, the virus has successfully been recreated from DNA sequences found in buried dead. The recreated strains cause the disease in primates, so we can recreate Spanish flu in other primates outside of ourselves. So why would we do this? Why are researchers doing this? Well, reasons for recreating the strain include creating vaccines for it and for related flus like bird flu. However, the armed forces were among the agencies contributing to the research, so perhaps there is some consideration of using it as a bioweapon. It's hard to know. Now, that's digging up the original form of the Spanish flu that caused these 50 to 100 million deaths in 2 years. But I want to remind you that the Spanish flu is still with us today in an evolved form, right? So diseases evolve over time, and actually they evolve even more rapidly than animals and plants because they procreate so quickly. So if every time you have a baby, there's a chance for a mutation. Well, if you're having a baby every 30 years, that's not very fast for mutations to collect. But if you're having a baby every minute, in the case of viruses, or hundreds of babies every minute, you know, quote unquote babies, well, then the opportunities for mutations to collect is really high, right? And so diseases tend to evolve fairly rapidly. And the Spanish flu the descendants of the Spanish flu is still with us today, but it's a milder version, right? It's not the exact same flu that caused that destruction, but it's not that we eradicated the Spanish flu. It's that we controlled its environment, we prevented spread, people who had lethal strains died out, and so those were dead ends for the virus, and eventually milder strains have you know, we don't know where the Spanish flu came from, but once it entered the human population, once a new disease enters the human population, there's this huge amount of destruction, and then usually things even out. You know, the disease and the human population reach some sort of more balanced interaction with each other. So there's lots of strains of the flu around today, and many of them, there are descendants of the original Spanish flu that still live amongst us, but in a much milder, less lethal form. It's not that it doesn't cause death, because obviously people die from the flu, but it's not like it was when it first arose in the human population.